Mr. Peterson, this is a surprise. I'm sure it is. I was calling because I wanted to apologize for how our interview went last month. I've since learned more about your background, and I realize we may have made an error in judgment. An error in judgment. That was one way to describe assuming I was lying about my military service because I didn't look old enough to have earned my credentials. I appreciate that, Mr. Peterson. The thing is, we have another position opening up, something that might be a better fit for someone with your unique background. I was hoping you might be willing to come in for another conversation. Another position opening up. After weeks of silence following my interview, after dismissing my experience and questioning my qualifications, now they wanted another conversation because they'd learned more about my background. Can I ask what prompted this change of perspective? There was a pause on the other end of the line, long enough that I wondered if he was going to answer honestly or try to spin the situation in a way that made his company look better. We had a consultant come in last week to review our hiring practices, he said finally. She pointed out some patterns in our rejection decisions that were, frankly, embarrassing. Your interview was one of the examples she used to illustrate how unconscious bias can cause us to overlook qualified candidates. Unconscious bias. At least he was being honest about what had happened, even if it had taken a consultant to point out what should have been obvious from my resume and interview responses. I see. And what did this consultant recommend? Better verification procedures for military candidates, more structured interviews focused on competencies rather than impressions, and follow-up calls to people we may have misjudged initially. That sounds like good advice. It is. Which brings me back to my original question. Would you be willing to meet with us again? This new position involves working directly with defense contractors on procurement issues. The salary range is significantly higher than what we discussed before. Significantly higher salary, direct work with defense contractors, a chance to prove myself to people who'd initially written me off. 6 weeks ago, this phone call would have felt like vindication. Now, it felt like too little, too late. I appreciate the offer, Mr. Peterson, but I've already accepted a position elsewhere. Oh, another pause. Can I ask where? Titan Defense Solutions. I'm the technical lead on a classified Pentagon contract. The silence that followed was longer than the previous pauses, long enough that I could almost hear him processing what I'd just told him. Titan Defense Solutions was one of the biggest names in the industry. Exactly the kind of company that Peterson Associates competed with for major contracts. The technical lead position on a classified Pentagon contract was exactly the kind of role that his company would have loved to place one of their people in. That's quite an opportunity, he said finally. Congratulations. Thank you. I don't suppose there's any chance you'd be interested in hearing about our position anyway? Sometimes it's good to keep options open. Options. 6 weeks ago, I'd needed options because no one was willing to give me a chance. Now, I had work that mattered, colleagues who respected my experience, and the opportunity to save lives by sharing knowledge I'd earned in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. I'm very happy where I am, Mr. Peterson, but I do appreciate you taking the time to call. Of course. And again, I apologize for how things went during your interview. We're working to do better in the future. After hanging up, I sat in my office looking out at the Phoenix skyline and thinking about the conversation. 6 weeks ago, that apology would have meant everything to me. The acknowledgement that I'd been misjudged. The admission that unconscious bias had affected their decision. The offer of a second chance with better terms. All of it would have felt like validation after months of rejection and dismissal. Now, it just felt like confirmation that I'd ended up exactly where I belonged. Not because Peterson and Associates had finally recognized my worth, but because Colonel Stone had seen it from the beginning. Not because someone was willing to give me a chance despite my age, but because someone understood that my age was irrelevant compared to my experience and competence. The phone rang again, this time with a call I'd been expecting. It was Angela Turner, calling to confirm our travel arrangements for the Fort Bragg visit. All set for Wednesday morning, she said. Flight leaves Phoenix at 06:30, puts us in Fayetteville by 1400. I've arranged for base transportation and lodging through Friday. Outstanding. Have you had a chance to review the casualty reports from their last training cycle? Just finished reading them. 3 fatalities in the past 6 months, all during advanced scenarios. 2 of them were experienced technicians who should have known better. Which suggests systemic issues rather than individual errors. Exactly. That's what makes this visit so important. We're not just reviewing training methods. We're trying to understand why experienced people are making fatal mistakes. Wednesday morning came with the pre-dawn darkness that military personnel know well, the time when important missions begin and critical work gets done while most people are still sleeping. Angela met me at the airport, both of us carrying the kind of practical luggage that suggested business travel rather than vacation, both dressed in the conservative clothing that defense contractors wear when visiting military installations. The flight to North Carolina gave us time to review our observation protocols and discuss what we hoped to learn from the visit. Angela had been to Fort Bragg several times during her Air Force career, and she provided insights into the base culture and training philosophy that would help us understand what we were seeing. The thing about Bragg, she said as we descended through clouds that looked like gray cotton, is that they take pride in being the best. They train the most elite units, handle the most challenging missions, and maintain standards that other installations aspire to reach. Which means they might be resistant to suggestions that their methods need improvement. Possibly, but it also means they care deeply about keeping their people alive. If we can show them better ways to do that, they'll listen. Fort Bragg was exactly what I'd expected. Endless rows of barracks and training facilities, soldiers moving with purpose between buildings, vehicles and equipment that spoke of serious military business. The EOD training facility was located in a restricted area that required special clearances and escort officers, a reminder that the work being done here was both dangerous and classified. Master Sergeant Patricia Williams met us at the facility entrance, a woman in her 40s with the kind of bearing that suggested decades of military service and absolute competence in her field. Her handshake was firm, her eye contact direct, and her first question was exactly what I'd hoped to hear. "Before we begin the tour," she said, "I'd like to understand your backgrounds so I know what level of detail to provide in our discussions." Angela provided her credentials first, mentioning her Air Force service and current work with Titan Defense Solutions. Then it was my turn. Staff Sergeant Sarah Martinez, retired, 15 years active duty with 8 years in EOD, multiple deployments to Afghanistan and Iraq, experience with vehicle-borne devices, chemical threats, and training new technicians in combat zones. Master Sergeant Williams nodded approvingly. "Outstanding. It's good to be working with people who understand the realities of what we're trying to teach here." The tour that followed was comprehensive and sobering. We observed live training exercises, reviewed classroom instruction, and interviewed students at various stages of their EOD education. The facilities were impressive, the equipment was state-of-the-art, and the instructors were clearly dedicated professionals who cared deeply about their students' success. But there were problems. Subtle issues that became apparent only after hours of observation and dozens of conversations with personnel at all levels. Training scenarios that didn't reflect current threat environments. Protocols that prioritized speed over thoroughness. Assessment methods that measured technical knowledge but not practical judgment under pressure. "The students are learning to recognize and neutralize specific types of devices," I told Angela during a break between observations. "But they're not learning to think like bomb makers, to anticipate variations and innovations." Agreed. They're being trained to handle known threats, not to adapt to unknown ones, which works fine until they encounter something they haven't seen before. That evening, we had dinner with several of the training cadre, including Master Sergeant Williams and 2 other senior instructors who'd been teaching EOD techniques for years. The conversation was frank and professional, with none of the defensiveness I'd worried we might encounter. "We know we have issues," Master Sergeant Williams admitted over coffee. "The casualty rates speak for themselves. What we need is fresh perspective from people who've been there and understand what we're trying to accomplish." "The fundamentals are solid," I said. "Your students are learning excellent technical skills and safety procedures. But the threat environment has evolved faster than training methods. We need to help them develop adaptive thinking, not just technical proficiency." "How do you teach adaptive thinking?" "The same way you learn it in combat zones. Present scenarios with incomplete information, time pressure, and consequences for mistakes. Make them think through problems rather than just recognizing patterns." The discussion continued late into the evening, with ideas flowing back and forth between people who shared a common understanding of what was at stake. These instructors wanted their students to succeed, to survive, to come home alive from whatever deployments awaited them. They were willing to change methods, adapt curricula, and implement new approaches if it meant better outcomes for the soldiers they trained. By Friday afternoon, we had enough observations and data to begin developing our recommendations. The flight back to Phoenix was productive, with Angela and me comparing notes and identifying specific areas where new training protocols could make a difference. "This is going to work," she said as we descended toward Sky Harbor Airport. We have the right team, the right mission, and clients who actually want to improve rather than just maintain status quo. She was right. For the first time since leaving the military, I felt like I was part of something important, something that would make a real difference in the lives of people I'd never meet, but whose situations I understood intimately. Monday morning brought another surprise phone call, this one from someone I hadn't heard from in years. Sarah Martinez? This is Lieutenant Colonel David Chen. I think you might remember me as Captain Chen from your deployment to Kandahar in 2019. I remembered him well, a young officer who'd been assigned to our forward operating base, fresh out of West Point and eager to prove himself in a combat zone. I'd worked with him on several missions, including the marketplace incident that had earned me the Bronze Star. Of course, sir. Congratulations on your promotion. Thank you. I'm calling because I heard through military channels that you're working with Titan Defense Solutions on EOD training protocols. That's correct, sir. Outstanding. I'm currently assigned to the Pentagon, working on training and doctrine development for Special Operations Forces. We've been looking for someone with your background to consult on some new initiatives. Another opportunity, another chance to use my experience in meaningful work. 6 months ago, I'd been struggling to get anyone to take my qualifications seriously. Now, I was getting calls from Pentagon officials who wanted my expertise. I'd be interested in hearing more about what you have in mind. I can't discuss details over an unsecured line, but it involves developing training scenarios for some of our most elite units, the kind of work that requires someone who's been there and understands what reality looks like. I understand, sir. Would you be available for a meeting in Washington next month? I can have travel orders cut and arrange for appropriate clearances. I'll have to coordinate with my current project timeline, but yes, I think that would be possible. After hanging up, I sat in my office thinking about how much had changed in just a few weeks. From unemployment and rejection to multiple opportunities with organizations that actually understood the value of military experience. From feeling like my age was a liability to working with people who recognized that starting young in high-stakes work could be an advantage. The Bronze Star certificate that Colonel Stone had presented to me was now framed and hanging on my office wall, along with my other military commendations and my EOD certifications, not as trophies or decorations, but as reminders of the work I'd done and the standards I'd maintained throughout my military career. My computer chimed with an email from Colonel Stone, asking me to come to her office when I had a moment. I found her reviewing what appeared to be contract documents, her expression serious but satisfied. The Pentagon meeting has been moved up, she said without preamble. They want to see our preliminary recommendations next Wednesday instead of next month. Are we ready for that timeline? We will be. The Fort Bragg observations gave us everything we need for a solid presentation, and your insights about adaptive thinking versus pattern recognition have become the centerpiece of our recommendations. She handed me a document marked with classification stamps. This is the presentation outline. I want you to deliver the technical sections and field observations. You'll be briefing a room full of colonels and generals, including some people who control budgets for military training programs across all branches of service. Next Wednesday. In 9 days, I'd be standing in the Pentagon, explaining to senior military officials how to save the lives of soldiers I'd never meet. It was exactly the kind of responsibility I'd hoped to find when I left the military, exactly the kind of work that made civilian careers meaningful. I'll be ready, ma'am. I know you will. And Sarah? This is the kind of presentation that can define a career. If we do this right, Titan Defense Solutions becomes the go-to contractor for advanced military training. If you do this right, you become the person everyone calls when they need expertise in this field. That evening, I called my mother for the first time in weeks. She'd been following my job search with the kind of worried optimism that military families develop when their children transition to civilian careers. Sarah, how's the new job going? Better than I could have hoped, Mom. I'm briefing Pentagon officials next week about new training protocols that could save lives. Pentagon officials? My daughter is briefing Pentagon officials? I could hear the pride in her voice, the same pride she'd shown when I'd enlisted at 17. When I'd graduated from EOD school, when I'd received each promotion and commendation during my military career. But this was different somehow, validation that the civilian world could recognize and value the same qualities that had made me successful in the military. It's just one meeting, Mom. But yes, it's a big opportunity. I always knew you'd find your place. You just needed to find people who understood what you'd accomplished. She was right, of course. The problem had never been my qualifications or my experience. The problem had been finding people who could see past my appearance to understand what those 15 years of service really meant. The weekend passed quickly as I prepared for the Pentagon presentation, reviewing technical data, practicing delivery, and coordinating with Angela and the rest of the team. By Monday morning, I felt ready for whatever questions or challenges the meeting might bring. Tuesday afternoon brought one final surprise. A package arrived at my office with no return address, just my name and the Titan Defense Solutions address written in careful handwriting. Inside was a challenge coin for my old EOD unit, along with a note from my former team leader. "Martinez," the note read, "heard you were back in the fight, just wearing different uniform now. This coin belongs to people who've earned it through blood, sweat, and keeping others alive. You've earned it twice over. Make us proud in D.C. Semper Fi, Gunny Rodriguez." I turned the coin over in my hands, feeling the weight of metal and memory. Challenge coins were military tradition, given to recognize exceptional service or significant achievements. This particular coin bore the EOD symbol and the motto, "Initial Success or Total Failure," words that had guided my decisions for 8 years of military service. Now, as I prepared to brief Pentagon officials about training protocols that could save lives, those words felt as relevant as ever. Initial success or total failure. No middle ground, no partial credit, no second chances when lives hung in the balance. Wednesday morning, I stood in my apartment, looking at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. Same face, same youthful features that had worked against me for so many months. But everything else had changed. Today, I wasn't Sarah Martinez, the young veteran who couldn't get hired. Today, I was Sarah Martinez, technical expert, Bronze Star recipient, the person Titan Defense Solutions trusted to represent their company to the most senior military officials in the country. The challenge coin was in my pocket as I walked out the door, a reminder of where I'd come from and what I'd accomplished. In a few hours, I'd be standing in the Pentagon, using my experience to help other soldiers stay alive. It was exactly what I'd hoped to find when I started looking for meaningful work in the civilian world. It was exactly where I belonged. The Pentagon is exactly as imposing as you'd imagine, a massive concrete fortress that seems to absorb sunlight rather than reflect it. Walking through the entrance with Colonel Stone and Angela, I felt the weight of history in every corridor, every security checkpoint, every uniformed guard who scrutinized our credentials with the kind of attention that comes from protecting the nerve center of American military power. Our escort was a Navy lieutenant commander who moved with the efficient purposefulness of someone accustomed to navigating the Pentagon's seemingly endless hallways. She led us through corridors lined with portraits of former defense secretaries and joint chiefs of staff, past conference rooms where decisions affecting millions of lives had been made, toward the briefing room where I would present our findings to some of the most senior military officials in the country. The attendees include representatives from all service branches, she explained as we walked. General Patricia Hayes from Army Training and Doctrine Command, Admiral Robert Chen from Naval Education and Training Command, General Michael Rodriguez from Air Education and Training Command, and General Sarah Washington from Marine Corps Training and Education Command. Also present will be Dr. Elizabeth Turner from the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency and Colonel James Burke from Special Operations Command. Each name carried weight, representing decades of military experience and responsibility for training the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines who would face threats in combat zones around the world. These were people who understood that training decisions had life-and-death consequences, who knew that the protocols we recommended could mean the difference between personnel coming home alive or in flag-draped coffins. The briefing room was smaller than I'd expected but more impressive, with a polished mahogany table surrounded by leather chairs and walls lined with secure communication equipment. At one end of the room stood a large display screen connected to classified computer systems, where our presentation would be projected for the assembled officials. Colonel Stone had insisted that I lead the technical portions of the briefing, the sections dealing with current training deficiencies and our recommended solutions. She would handle the administrative and contractual aspects, but the core content, the part that would determine whether our recommendations were accepted or rejected, would come from me. "Remember," she said quietly as we set up our materials, "these are people who've spent their careers in the military. They understand the stakes involved, and they respect competence. Let the work speak for itself. The officials began arriving at precisely 1400 hours, each entering with the bearing and confidence that came from holding positions of significant responsibility. General Hayes was a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd seen everything the military had to offer. Admiral Chen appeared to be in his early 60s, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent years at sea before transitioning to administrative roles. The others carried themselves with similar authority, people accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of personnel. As they took their seats around the table, I noticed something that would have been intimidating 6 months earlier, but now felt familiar. I was the youngest person in the room by at least 15 years, and the only one who wasn't wearing a uniform or didn't have decades of institutional military experience. 6 months ago, that would have made me question whether I belonged here. Now, it reminded me that I'd been chosen for this briefing because of what I knew, not despite how old I looked. "Good afternoon, everyone," Colonel Stone began, standing at the head of the table. "Thank you for taking time from your schedules to review our preliminary findings on explosive ordnance disposal training protocols. As you know, casualty rates during EOD training have increased significantly over the past 2 years, and we believe we've identified both the causes and potential solutions." She gestured toward me. Leading our technical analysis is Sarah Martinez, former staff sergeant with 15 years of active duty service, including 8 years in EOD operations across multiple combat deployments. She'll be presenting our field observations and recommendations. I stood and activated the presentation display, feeling the familiar calm that came from being thoroughly prepared for an important mission. The first slide showed casualty statistics from the past 5 years, a stark graph that illustrated the increasing danger faced by personnel during what should have been safe training environments. Over the past 24 months, I began, EOD training facilities across all service branches have experienced a 43% increase in serious injuries and a 67% increase in fatalities during advanced training scenarios. These incidents are occurring primarily among personnel with 6 months to 2 years of experience, suggesting that current training methods are not adequately preparing them for complex real-world situations. General Hayes leaned forward slightly. "What's your assessment of the primary contributing factors?" Our field observations identified 3 critical issues. First, current training scenarios focus on pattern recognition rather than adaptive thinking. Students learn to identify and neutralize specific types of devices, but they struggle when confronted with variations or innovations they haven't seen before. I clicked to the next slide, which showed photographs from our Fort Bragg observations. Second, time pressure during training doesn't reflect the reality of combat situations. In actual deployments, EOD technicians often have the luxury of careful analysis and methodical approaches. Training scenarios that emphasize speed over thoroughness create dangerous habits that persist in field operations. Admiral Chen nodded thoughtfully. And the third issue? Assessment methods that measure technical knowledge rather than practical judgment under stress. Students can pass written examinations and demonstrate proficiency with specific procedures, but they haven't learned to make decisions when information is incomplete or when standard protocols don't apply. The room was quiet as I continued through our findings, presenting data from multiple installations and interviews with dozens of personnel at various levels of experience. These weren't theoretical problems or abstract concepts. They were specific, documented issues that were killing young soldiers who should have had long careers ahead of them. "Your recommendations?" General Rodriguez asked. "We propose a 3-phase restructuring of advanced EOD training. Phase 1 involves developing scenario-based exercises that require adaptive thinking rather than pattern recognition. Instead of presenting students with known device types, we create situations where they must analyze unfamiliar threats and develop neutralization procedures in real time." I clicked through slides showing detailed training scenarios we'd developed, each designed to challenge students' ability to think through problems rather than simply apply memorized procedures. These weren't academic exercises. They were based on actual situations I'd encountered during deployments, situations where following standard protocols would have resulted in casualties. Phase 2 restructures time management training to reflect operational realities. Instead of artificial time pressure, we create scenarios where students must balance thoroughness with mission requirements, learning to make informed decisions about when to proceed and when to request additional resources. Dr. Turner from DARPA raised her hand. How do you measure success in these modified scenarios? That's phase 3 of our recommendations. We propose developing assessment criteria that evaluate decision-making processes rather than just outcomes. Students are graded on their ability to gather and analyze information, consider multiple approaches, and adapt to changing conditions. Technical proficiency remains important, but it becomes one component of overall competence, rather than the sole measure of success. The presentation continued for another 30 minutes as I walked through specific implementation strategies, resource requirements, and expected timelines. Each slide contained detailed information based on our field observations and analysis, concrete recommendations that could be implemented immediately rather than theoretical improvements that might work in ideal conditions. When I finished, the room remained quiet for several moments as the assembled officials reviewed their notes and considered what they'd heard. Finally, General Washington spoke. Ms. Martinez, can you walk us through a specific example of how these new training methods would address current deficiencies? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They looked at my face and saw a college kid. They heard my voice and assumed I was playing dress-up. But when that hiring manager finally read my resume out loud, the entire room went silent. Because what they didn't know was that I'd been carrying a rifle since I was 17, and some lessons you can only learn when bullets are flying over your head. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I should have known the interview was going sideways the moment I walked into Peterson Associates. The receptionist, a blonde woman with perfectly manicured nails and a smile that didn't reach her eyes, looked me up and down like I'd stumbled into the wrong building. I was wearing my best black blazer, the one I'd bought specifically for job interviews, with matching slacks and flats that made no sound on the marble floor. Professional. Appropriate. Exactly what the career counselor had recommended. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone suggesting she was already planning to direct me toward the nearest Starbucks. "Sarah Martinez," I said, extending my hand. "I have a 2 o'clock with Mr. Peterson for the defense contractor position." She stared at my outstretched hand for a beat too long before shaking it limply. "Oh, you're the candidate with the military background." The way she said military background made it sound like I'd claimed to be an astronaut. "Please have a seat. Mr. Peterson will be right with you." The waiting area was all glass and chrome, with leather chairs that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Everything about the place screamed success and sophistication, from the abstract art on the walls to the coffee table books about architectural design that no one ever actually read. I chose a chair facing the hallway, an old habit that never died. Even in the safest places, I needed to see who was coming and going. 20 minutes passed. Then, 30. I checked my phone twice, not because I didn't know what time it was, but because sitting still in unfamiliar places made my skin crawl. The receptionist kept glancing at me over her computer monitor, probably wondering why I hadn't gotten bored and left yet. What she didn't understand was that I'd learned patience in places where moving too soon could get you killed. Finally, a man in his 50s emerged from the hallway, his silver hair perfectly styled and his navy suit pressed to military precision. This had to be Peterson. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no, never had to prove himself beyond the weight of his wallet or the firmness of his handshake. "Miss Martinez?" He approached with his hand extended, and I stood to meet him. "James Peterson. Sorry to keep you waiting." "No problem at all, sir." The "sir" slipped out automatically, a reflex from years when showing respect wasn't optional but survival. He gestured toward the hallway. "Let's head to the conference room. I have a few colleagues who'd like to meet you as well." The conference room was even more impressive than the lobby, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Phoenix and a table that could have seated 20 people comfortably. 3 men were already seated, each wearing variations of the same expensive suit and practiced smile. Peterson made quick introductions: David Chin, head of operations, Robert Walsh, senior project manager, and Thomas Burke, who apparently handled government contracts. "Please sit wherever you'd like," Peterson said, taking his place at the head of the table. I chose a seat with my back to the wall. Another habit that probably seemed odd to them but felt necessary to me. They arranged themselves across from me like a panel of judges, each with a copy of my resume in front of them, and expressions that ranged from politely skeptical to openly doubtful. "So," Peterson began, settling back in his chair, "tell us about yourself, Sarah. What brings a young woman like you to the defense contracting world?" Young woman, there it was. The phrase that had followed me through every interview, every networking event, every professional interaction since I'd left the service. I was 29 years old, but something about my face, my voice, or maybe just the way I carried myself, made people assume I was barely out of college. "Well, sir, I've spent the last 15 years working in defense, primarily in combat zones. I have extensive experience with logistics coordination, threat assessment, and personnel management under high-stress conditions." I kept my voice steady, professional, the same tone I'd used when briefing colonels and generals who actually understood what those words meant. Chen leaned forward slightly, his eyebrows raised. 15 years? You mean like ROTC in high school and college?" "No, sir. Active duty military service. I enlisted when I was 17 and served 4 tours of duty in Afghanistan and 2 in Iraq." The room got quiet for a moment. Not the good kind of quiet that meant they were impressed, but the awkward quiet that meant they thought I was lying. Walsh shuffled through my resume, probably looking for my birth date to do the math in his head. 17. Burke spoke up for the first time, his voice carrying the kind of skepticism usually reserved for used car salesmen and politicians. "That seems quite young to be making such a significant commitment." "I had my parents' permission and graduated high school early," I explained, the same explanation I'd given dozens of times to dozens of people who couldn't understand why a kid would choose combat boots over college parties. I knew what I wanted to do with my life. Peterson cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. "And what exactly did you do during your time in the military?" "I started as infantry, then moved into explosive ordnance disposal after my first deployment. I spent most of my career leading teams responsible for clearing IEDs and investigating blast sites. During my last 3 years of service, I was a staff sergeant responsible for training new EOD technicians." "Explosive ordnance disposal," Walsh repeated slowly, like he was trying to understand a foreign language. "You mean like bomb disposal?" "Yes, sir. Improvised explosive devices, unexploded ordnance, chemical weapons. Pretty much anything that could blow up and kill people." The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't skeptical anymore. It was the kind of silence that happens when people realize they might be out of their depth. Chen was staring at his copy of my resume like it might explode if he looked at it wrong. "That's quite a claim," Peterson said finally. "EOD work is extremely dangerous and requires extensive training. You're saying you did this for how long?" 8 years in EOD specifically, sir. The first 4 years I was regular infantry." Burke leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed over his chest. "No offense, Miss Martinez, but you look like you could be my daughter's age. My daughter is 22 and just graduated from college. You're telling us you've been disarming bombs since she was in middle school?" The condescension in his voice hit me like a physical slap. I'd been disarming bombs while his daughter was worried about algebra tests and prom dates. I'd been teaching 19-year-old soldiers how to stay alive while she was pledging sororities and complaining about dining hall food. But explaining that to him would only make me sound defensive, and defensive wasn't going to get me this job. "I understand it might seem unusual," I said instead, "but the military has always been willing to promote based on capability rather than age. When you're good at keeping people alive, they tend to notice." "Keeping people alive," Chen repeated, and I could hear the air quotes in his voice even though his hands stayed flat on the table. That's a very dramatic way to put it. Something cold settled in my stomach. These men, sitting in their climate-controlled conference room with their expensive suits and their skeptical smiles, had no idea what those words actually meant. They'd never held pressure on a sucking chest wound while mortars fell around them. They'd never had to choose between cutting the red wire or the blue wire with 30 seconds on the timer and 6 lives hanging in the balance. They thought military service was something you did for a few years between high school and real life, like an extended summer camp with better stories. "I suppose it might sound dramatic to civilians," I said, keeping my voice level despite the heat rising in my chest. "But when you're responsible for clearing roads so supply convoys can get through safely, Or when you're disarming devices that could kill entire squads of soldiers, keeping people alive becomes pretty literal. Walsh was shaking his head now, not bothering to hide his disbelief. Look, I'm sure you've done some impressive things in the military, but EOD work is typically reserved for the most experienced personnel. They don't just hand that job to teenagers. They hand it to people who can do it, I said. Age is less important than competence when lives are on the line. But surely you understand our position, Peterson said, his tone taking on the patronizing quality of someone explaining why Santa Claus isn't real. We're looking for someone with real-world experience in high-stakes situations, someone who can handle the pressure of multi-million-dollar defense contracts and the responsibility that comes with that level of trust. Real-world experience. As if 6 combat deployments and 8 years of defusing explosives didn't count as real-world experience because it happened while wearing a uniform instead of a suit. As if the skills that kept soldiers alive in Kandahar somehow couldn't translate to keeping projects on track in Phoenix. I led a team of 12 EOD technicians during my last deployment, I said, my patience starting to fray around the edges. We cleared over 300 devices during a 9-month rotation and didn't lose a single person. I've briefed generals, coordinated with international coalition forces, and managed logistics for operations involving thousands of personnel. I'm not sure what additional experience you're looking for. Burke laughed, actually laughed, like I'd just told him I'd been to the moon. 300 devices in 9 months? That's almost 1 a day. Do you really expect us to believe that? The question hit me like a punch to the gut, not because it hurt, but because it revealed just how little these men understood about the world I'd lived in for the better part of my adult life. 1 device a day wasn't impressive. It was Tuesday. There were days when we'd clear 5 or 6 IEDs before lunch. Days when the insurgents were feeling particularly creative, and the roads were littered with everything from simple pressure plates to sophisticated vehicle-borne devices that could level entire buildings. I don't expect you to believe anything, I said, my voice dropping to the tone I'd used when explaining to overconfident lieutenants why they needed to follow my lead instead of trying to prove themselves. I expect you to do your due diligence and verify the information I've provided. My DD-214 has all the details of my service record, including deployments, commendations, and specific assignments. Your what? Chet asked. DD-214. It's the official document that shows your military service history. Every veteran gets one when they separate from the service. The 4 men exchanged glances, the kind of looks that said they were all thinking the same thing, but nobody wanted to be the first to say it out loud. Finally, Peterson cleared his throat and leaned forward. Sarah, we appreciate you coming in today, and we're certainly impressed by your enthusiasm. But I think there might be a misunderstanding about the nature of this position. We're looking for someone with significant leadership experience, someone who can handle complex negotiations with Pentagon officials and manage teams of seasoned professionals. I understand that, I said. That's exactly the kind of work I've been doing for the past 8 years. In the military, Walsh added, as if that somehow disqualified everything I'd just explained. The civilian sector is different. The stakes are different. The people you're dealing with are different. The stakes are different. I wanted to laugh, but I was afraid if I started, I might not be able to stop. The stakes were different, because instead of lives hanging in the balance, it was money. Instead of preventing soldiers from getting blown up, we'd be preventing cost overruns. Instead of keeping people from dying, we'd be keeping shareholders happy. I'm confident I can adapt to the civilian environment, I said. The leadership principles are the same whether you're managing a squad or a project team. Clear communication, accountability, mission focus. But you're so young, Peterson said, and there it was again, the phrase that followed me everywhere. Our clients expect to work with seasoned professionals. When they see someone who looks like they just graduated from college, it affects their confidence in our company. Young. As if youth automatically meant inexperience. As if the gray hairs I'd started finding weren't earned in the mountains of Afghanistan and the deserts of Iraq. As if the lines around my eyes didn't come from squinting through smoke and dust while trying to identify the signature of buried explosives. I understand your concern about client perception, I said, choosing my words carefully. But I'd ask you to consider that competence and experience aren't always reflected in someone's appearance. Some of the best soldiers I worked with were barely old enough to vote, and some of the worst decisions I saw were made by people with decades of experience who'd never actually been tested under pressure. Burke was shaking his head again, more vigorously this time. That's exactly what I'm talking about. You keep referring back to military examples, but this isn't the military. This is business. This is about managing relationships with defense contractors and Pentagon officials who expect to deal with mature, experienced professionals. Mature, experienced professionals. Code words for older white men who'd never had to prove themselves beyond the strength of their handshake and the quality of their golf game. Men who'd built their careers on relationships and connections rather than competence and results. I've briefed Pentagon officials, I said. I've worked directly with defense contractors on equipment specifications and deployment requirements. I've managed relationships with international coalition partners and local government officials in some of the most challenging environments on Earth. But have you done it in a business context? Chen asked. Have you negotiated contracts worth millions of dollars? Have you presented to boards of directors or handled media relations for a major corporation? No, I hadn't. But I'd done something harder. I'd made life and death decisions with incomplete information while people were shooting at me. I'd kept my team alive and mission-focused when everything was falling apart around us. I'd earned the trust and respect of people whose lives depended on my judgment and competence. But I could see in their faces that none of that mattered to them. They had already made up their minds the moment I walked in the door. Too young, too inexperienced, too different from what they expected a qualified candidate to look like. I think we have everything we need, Peterson said, standing up from his chair with the finality of someone ending a conversation that had gone on too long. We'll be in touch within the next few days to let you know our decision. The other 3 men stood as well, suddenly very interested in their phones and their watches and anything that didn't require them to make eye contact with me. I gathered my purse and the portfolio I'd brought with copies of my certifications and commendations, documents they hadn't even bothered to look at. Thank you for your time, I said, extending my hand to Peterson. He shook it briefly, his grip firm but distracted, already moving on to whatever was next on his schedule. Of course. We'll be in touch. But I knew they wouldn't be. I could see it in the way they avoided looking at me as I walked toward the door, in the way the receptionist's fake smile had returned as I passed her desk, in the way the whole place seemed to exhale with relief once I was gone. Outside, the Phoenix sun was brutal, turning the parking lot into a furnace that made my professional blazer feel like a straitjacket. I sat in my car for a long moment, letting the air conditioning struggle against the heat while I processed what had just happened. This was the 4th interview in 6 weeks, and they'd all followed the same script. Initial interest based on my resume, growing skepticism as they realized how young I looked, and final dismissal disguised as, "We'll be in touch." I'd spent 15 years serving my country, 8 of those in one of the most dangerous jobs the military had to offer. I'd saved lives, led teams, and made decisions that most people couldn't imagine having to make. But none of that mattered, because I looked like someone's kid's sister playing dress-up in a business suit. The drive home took me through downtown Phoenix, past office buildings full of people who'd never had to wonder if today would be the day they didn't make it home. Past restaurants where the biggest decision was whether to order the salmon or the chicken, not whether to cut the red wire or the blue wire. Past a world that valued appearance over substance, connections over competence, and comfort over courage. My apartment was a small 1-bedroom in a complex that catered to young professionals, which was ironic since I'd been a professional longer than most of my neighbors had been adults. The walls were bare except for a single framed photo, my EOD team from my last deployment, 12 faces smiling at the camera despite everything we'd been through together. Some of them were older than me, some younger, but age had never mattered when we were working. Competence mattered. Trust mattered. Results mattered. I poured myself a glass of water and sat at my kitchen table, staring at my laptop screen and the job search websites that had become my daily routine. Defense contractors, security firms, consulting companies, all looking for experienced professionals with military backgrounds. All of them would probably take one look at me and see a kid pretending to be something she wasn't. But I wasn't pretending. I was exactly what my resume said I was, a combat veteran with 15 years of experience and a track record of success in high-stakes situations. The problem wasn't my qualifications or my experience. The problem was that I didn't look the part. And in a world where perception often mattered more than reality, that was becoming an insurmountable obstacle. Tomorrow I'd start the process again. I'd update my resume, send out more applications, and prepare for more interviews with more people who would smile politely while dismissing everything I'd accomplished because it didn't fit their preconceived notions of what a qualified candidate should look like. But tonight, I'd remember what it felt like to be valued for what I could do instead of how old I appeared to be. I'd remember the weight of responsibility that came with other people's lives in my hands and the satisfaction of bringing everyone home safe. I'd remember that competence and courage weren't determined by the number of years you'd been alive, but by what you'd done with those years. And maybe, just maybe, tomorrow would be different. Maybe tomorrow I'd walk into an office where someone would look past my face and see my record. Where someone would understand that real experience wasn't measured in years spent behind a desk, but in challenges overcome and responsibilities shouldered. Maybe tomorrow, someone would finally read past the first line of my resume and understand what those 15 years really meant. The call came 3 days later while I was grocery shopping, trying to decide between the name brand cereal and the store brand that cost half as much. Military habits die hard, and budgeting had become second nature after years of living on enlisted pay while sending money home to help my mom with her medical bills. Sarah Martinez? The voice was crisp, professional, with just a hint of a southern accent. Speaking. This is Colonel Rebecca Stone, retired, from Titan Defense Solutions. I received your resume through a mutual contact, and I'd like to discuss a position we have available. Are you available to meet tomorrow? I nearly dropped my phone. Titan Defense Solutions was one of the biggest names in the industry, the kind of company that handled contracts so classified that most people didn't even know they existed. They were also notorious for hiring only the most experienced professionals, people with decades of military service and connections that reached into the highest levels of the Pentagon. Yes, ma'am. I'm available whenever works for you. Excellent. Can you be at our Phoenix office at 1000 hours tomorrow? The address is 2847 North Central Avenue, 15th floor. I'll be there, Colonel. Outstanding. And Sarah? Bring your DD-214 and any documentation of your EOD certifications. We'll want to verify everything before we proceed. The line went dead, and I stood there in the cereal aisle holding my phone, wondering if I'd just imagined the entire conversation. A retired colonel who actually knew what a DD-214 was. Someone who understood that EOD certifications weren't something you could fake or exaggerate. This felt different from the other interviews. More serious, more real. That night, I laid out my best suit again. The same black blazer and slacks that had failed to impress the last 4 companies I'd interviewed with. But this time felt different. This time, I was meeting with someone who spoke my language. Someone who understood that military experience meant something more than just following orders and looking good in uniform. The Titan Defense Building was downtown, a sleek glass tower that rose 40 stories into the desert sky. The lobby was understated but expensive, with marble floors and abstract art that probably cost more than most people made in a year. The security desk was staffed by 2 men who had the unmistakable bearing of former military, their eyes sharp and alert as they checked my identification against their visitor list. 15th floor, ma'am, one of them said, handing me a visitor badge. Elevator bank on your right. Colonel Stone is expecting you. The elevator ride seemed to take forever, my reflection staring back at me from the polished steel doors. I looked professional, competent, ready for business. But I also looked young, and that had been my downfall every time before. Would this be different? Would a retired colonel see past my appearance to the experience underneath? The 15th floor was quieter than I'd expected, with thick carpeting that muffled footsteps and offices with frosted glass doors bearing names I didn't recognize. The receptionist, a woman in her 40s with steel-gray hair and intelligent eyes, looked up from her computer as I approached. Sarah Martinez to see Colonel Stone, I said, offering my visitor badge. Right on time. She's waiting for you in conference room B. She gestured down a hallway lined with photographs of military aircraft and desert landscapes. 3rd door on your left. Conference room B was smaller than the corporate boardroom at Peterson Associates, with a simple rectangular table and chairs that looked functional rather than impressive. The walls were covered with maps, organizational charts, and photographs of military units in various desert locations. This wasn't a room designed to impress clients. It was a room designed for work. Colonel Stone was standing with her back to the door, studying what appeared to be a satellite image of some Middle Eastern city I didn't recognize. She was tall and lean, with silver hair cut in a precise bob and the kind of posture that screamed decades of military bearing. When she turned to face me, her eyes were the pale blue of desert sky, sharp and assessing but not unkind. "Sarah Martinez," she said, extending her hand. Her grip was firm and brief, exactly what I'd expected from a former colonel. "Rebecca Stone, thank you for coming in on short notice." "Thank you for the opportunity, ma'am. Please, have a seat." She gestured to a chair across from where she'd placed a thick manila folder. "Before we begin, I want you to know that I've already done my homework. I've spoken with 3 of your former commanding officers, reviewed your service record, and confirmed your EOD certifications with the appropriate authorities." My heart started beating faster. No one had ever bothered to verify my credentials before the interview. Most companies treated military service as a checkbox on a resume, something to be acknowledged but not investigated. The fact that she'd taken the time to check my background suggested this was more than just a courtesy interview. "I appreciate your thoroughness, Colonel. In this business, thoroughness isn't optional." She opened the folder and pulled out what I recognized as my complete military personnel file. Staff Sergeant Sarah Martinez, 15 years active duty, multiple deployments to Afghanistan and Iraq, 8 years in explosive ordnance disposal, with an exemplary record and no incidents resulting in casualties. She looked up from the file, her pale eyes meeting mine directly. "That's impressive. EOD work has one of the highest casualty rates of any military occupation specialty. Most people don't last 8 years, and very few manage to avoid losing people. I was fortunate to work with exceptional teams," I said. And I took the responsibility seriously. "According to your file, you were more than fortunate. You were skilled." She flipped through several pages, reading sections that I'd never seen myself. "Operation Desert Shield 2018. You disarmed a vehicle-borne, improvised explosive device in a marketplace in Kabul, while civilians were still in the blast radius. The device contained over 200 pounds of explosives and would have killed an estimated 40 to 60 people if it had detonated." I remembered that day with perfect clarity. The device had been sophisticated, with multiple redundant triggers and a timer that gave us less than 4 minutes to work. The local police had been trying to evacuate the marketplace, but it was the middle of the day, and people were reluctant to abandon their shops and stalls. I'd made the decision to attempt the disarm rather than wait for a full evacuation that might not happen in time. "It was the right call under the circumstances," I said. "It was a gutsy call that required exceptional technical skill and nerves of steel." She closed the file and leaned back in her chair. "Your commanding officer recommended you for the Bronze Star for that action. Did you know that?" I didn't. Awards and recognition had never been my focus. Keeping people alive had been my job, and I'd done it to the best of my ability. Medals were nice, but they didn't bring back the soldiers who didn't make it home. "I wasn't aware of that, ma'am. The paperwork got lost in the transition between commands. Bureaucracy at its finest." She pulled out another document, this one bearing the seal of the Department of Defense. I took the liberty of tracking down the original recommendation and having it processed. "This is yours." She slid the certificate across the table, and I stared at it in shock. The Bronze Star Medal with V Device for Valor, awarded to Staff Sergeant Sarah Martinez for heroic achievement in connection with military operations against an armed enemy. My name, printed in official typeface, with signatures and seals that made it real. "I don't understand," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You earned it 6 years ago." It just took this long for the system to catch up. Colonel Stone's expression softened slightly. Military bureaucracy moves slowly, but it moves. "Your actions saved lives, Sarah. That deserves recognition." I traced my finger along the edge of the certificate, still not quite believing it was real. In all the interviews I'd had, all the rejections and dismissive comments about my age and experience, no one had ever bothered to look deeply enough to find this. No one had cared enough to verify that my service record was more than just time served. "Now," Colonel Stone continued, "let's talk about why you're here. We have a position available that requires someone with your specific skill set. The client is the Department of Defense, the contract is classified, and the work involves training and consultation on improvised explosive device recognition and neutralization. My head snapped up from the certificate. Training consultation. We're developing new protocols for EOD teams based on lessons learned from recent deployments. We need someone who's been there, who understands the realities of the job, and who can translate that experience into effective training programs. She leaned forward, her expression serious. The contract is worth $12 million over 3 years. We need someone to lead the technical development team and interface directly with Pentagon officials and field commanders. $12 million. More money than I'd ever imagined being responsible for, but the work itself sounded like exactly what I'd been hoping to find. A chance to use my experience to help other EOD technicians stay alive, to share the lessons I'd learned in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. What would my role be specifically? Technical lead and primary client interface. You'd be responsible for developing training scenarios, reviewing existing protocols, and presenting recommendations to senior military leadership. You'd also travel to various military installations to observe current training and identify areas for improvement. It sounded too good to be true. After weeks of being told I was too young, too inexperienced, too different from what companies expected, here was someone offering me exactly the kind of work I was qualified to do. Can I ask why you're considering me for this position? I mean, there must be other candidates with more business experience. Colonel Stone smiled, the first time I'd seen her expression soften completely. There are plenty of candidates with business experience. What we need is someone with technical expertise and the credibility to stand in front of a room full of colonels and generals and tell them their current methods aren't good enough. She opened the folder again and pulled out what appeared to be a list of names. We've interviewed 8 other candidates for this position. All of them had impressive business backgrounds, all of them had advanced degrees, and all of them failed to understand the fundamental realities of EOD work. They could talk about project management and stakeholder engagement, but when we asked them to explain the difference between a pressure plate and a pull wire device, they gave us blank stares. I couldn't help but smile at that. The difference between a pressure plate and a pull wire device wasn't academic knowledge. It was the kind of information that kept you alive when you were crawling toward a suspicious object with your heart hammering in your chest. More importantly, she continued, when we contacted their references, we found a pattern. They were all competent managers, but none of them had ever been personally responsible for life and death decisions. None of them had ever had to perform under the kind of pressure that comes with knowing that one mistake could kill not just them, but everyone around them. She closed the folder and looked directly at me. You have. For 8 years you made those decisions and lived with that pressure. You kept your teams alive and accomplished your missions. That's not something you can learn in business school or pick up through on-the-job training. The weight of her words settled on me like a familiar burden. She was right, of course. The pressure of EOD work wasn't just about technical skill. It was about mental toughness, about the ability to function when everything depended on getting it right the first time. It was about leadership that came from competence rather than position, respect that was earned rather than assigned. There's something else, Colonel Stone said, her voice dropping slightly. The reason I called you specifically, beyond your qualifications, is that I've been watching the industry's response to veterans like you. Young women with exceptional service records who can't get hired because they don't fit the traditional mold. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Phoenix skyline. I spent 30 years in the military, and I saw the same thing there. Competent people being overlooked because of their age, their gender, their appearance. It's a waste of talent that we can't afford, especially in fields where lives depend on getting the best people regardless of what they look like. You're offering me this job because I'm young and female? I'm offering you this job because you're the most qualified candidate we've interviewed, and the fact that you're young and female just makes it more obvious how broken the hiring process is at most companies. She turned back to face me, her expression serious. But I'm also offering it because I think you'll do exceptional work and because this industry needs people who understand that competence matters more than comfort. I stared at the Bronze Star certificate still lying on the table between us, thinking about all the interviews where my age had been treated as a liability rather than an indicator of accelerated achievement. All the times I'd been dismissed as too young to understand real responsibility, too inexperienced to handle serious work. "What happens next?" I asked. "Next, you tell me if you're interested. If you are, we'll discuss salary and benefits, and I'll introduce you to the rest of the team. If you're not, we'll shake hands and you'll walk out of here with that bronze star and my recommendation for any future opportunities." The decision should have been difficult. This was a huge opportunity. The kind of job that could define my career for the next decade. But as I sat there looking at Colonel Stone, at the maps on the walls, at the certificate bearing my name, I realized there was no decision to make. This was exactly what I'd been looking for. A chance to use my experience, to be valued for what I'd accomplished rather than dismissed for what I looked like. "I'm interested," I said. "Outstanding." She returned to her seat and pulled out a leather portfolio. "Let's talk details. The starting salary is $140,000 annually, plus benefits and performance bonuses. You'll have your own office, a technical assistant, and direct access to our research and development resources. $140,000. More than double what I'd made as a staff sergeant. More than I'd ever imagined earning in the civilian world. But more than the money, it was the recognition that my experience had value. That the skills I developed in the military could translate into meaningful work in the civilian sector. There's a 90-day probationary period," she continued, "but based on your record, I don't anticipate any issues. We'll start you with our existing Pentagon contract, get you oriented with our systems and procedures, and then transition you to the lead role on the new project." "When would you need me to start?" "Monday, if you're available. We have a meeting with Defense Department officials next Friday, and I'd like you to observe before taking on the full responsibilities." Monday. 5 days from now, I'd be sitting in meetings with Pentagon officials, discussing training protocols that could save lives. 5 days from now, I'd be exactly where I'd hoped to be when I started this job search, using my experience to make a difference. "I'll be here Monday morning," I said. Colonel Stone extended her hand across the table. "Welcome to Titan Defense Solutions, Sarah. I think you're going to do exceptional work." As I shook her hand, I felt something I hadn't experienced since leaving the military, the sense that I was exactly where I belonged. Not because someone was doing me a favor or giving me a chance despite my limitations, but because I was the right person for the job. The elevator ride down to the lobby felt different from the ride up. I wasn't Sarah Martinez, the young veteran who couldn't get hired. I wasn't the girl who looked too young to have earned her credentials. I was Sarah Martinez, technical lead for a $12 million Defense Department contract, Bronze Star recipient, expert in explosive ordnance disposal. Outside, the Phoenix sun was just as brutal as it had been 3 days earlier when I'd left the Peterson Associates building. But this time, I didn't mind the heat. This time, I had somewhere to be on Monday morning, something meaningful to do with the skills I'd spent 15 years developing. As I drove home, I thought about the young EOD technicians who would benefit from the training protocols we'd develop. Soldiers who were probably my age or younger, facing the same dangers I'd faced, making the same life-and-death decisions that had defined my military career. The work I'd do at Titan wouldn't just be a job, it would be a continuation of the mission I'd started when I enlisted at 17. My phone buzzed with a text message as I pulled into my apartment complex. It was from my former team leader, someone I'd served with during my last deployment. "Heard through the grapevine that you landed something big. Proud of you, Martinez. About time someone recognized what you bring to the table." I smiled as I typed back, "Thanks, Sarge. Just getting started." Because that's exactly what this felt like. Not an ending to months of frustration and rejection, but the beginning of something that could be extraordinary. For the first time since leaving the military, I felt like I was moving forward rather than just surviving. For the first time in months, I felt like Sarah Martinez, the EOD expert, rather than Sarah Martinez, the young veteran who couldn't catch a break. Monday couldn't come soon enough. Monday morning arrived with the kind of desert sunrise that painted the Phoenix mountains in shades of gold and crimson. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, adjusting the collar of my navy blue blazer and checking my appearance one final time. Same face, same youthful features that had worked against me for months, but somehow everything felt different. Today, I wasn't walking into another interview where I'd have to prove my worth to people who'd already decided I was too young to matter. Today, I was walking into my office. The Titan Defense building looked different in the early morning light. more substantial somehow, like a place where serious work happened rather than just another corporate tower reaching toward the sky. The security guards recognized me from Friday's interview, nodding respectfully as they handed me a permanent access badge with my name and photo laminated beneath the company logo. "Welcome aboard, Ms. Martinez," one of them said. "Colonel Stone asked me to tell you she's expecting you in her office at 0800. 0800. Military time. Spoken naturally by someone who'd probably spent years using the same 24-hour clock that had governed my life for the past 15 years. It was a small thing, but it felt like coming home to a language I'd thought I'd have to abandon in the civilian world. Colonel Stone's office was on the 16th floor, one level up from the conference room where she'd offered me the job. The elevator doors opened to reveal a hallway lined with photographs of military operations, defense contractors at work, and formal portraits of men and women in uniform. My footsteps were muffled by thick carpeting as I walked toward the office at the end of the hall, where a nameplate read, "Colonel Rebecca Stone, Director of Operations." She was waiting for me with 2 cups of coffee and a stack of folders that looked thick enough to contain classified material. Her silver hair was pulled back in the same precise style, and she wore a charcoal gray suit that somehow managed to look both professional and practical. "Right on time," she said, gesturing to a chair across from her desk. "Coffee's black, military style. If you need cream or sugar, there's a break room down the hall." "Black is perfect, ma'am. We're going to get along just fine." She handed me one of the folders. "This is everything you need to know about the current contract. Background briefings, personnel files for the team you'll be working with, and preliminary reports from our field observations." I opened the folder to find documents marked with classification levels I hadn't seen since my last deployment. Secret, top secret. Compartmentalized information that required special clearances and careful handling. The fact that I was being trusted with this level of access on my first day spoke volumes about how seriously Colonel Stone took my qualifications. "Your security clearance transferred over from your military service," she explained, noticing my expression. "That's one of the advantages of hiring people with your background. We don't have to wait months for background investigations." The first document was a situation report from Fort Bragg, where EOD teams had been experiencing higher than normal casualty rates during training exercises. Young soldiers, some barely out of high school, were making mistakes that veteran technicians would never make. The report suggested that current training protocols weren't adequately preparing personnel for the realities they'd face in combat zones. "This is what we're trying to fix," Colonel Stone said, leaning back in her chair. "The military has been using the same EOD training methods for decades, but the threats have evolved. Improvised explosive devices are more sophisticated now, more varied, more unpredictable. The old ways of teaching recognition and neutralization aren't keeping pace." I flipped through more pages, seeing casualty reports and incident analyses that painted a grim picture. Soldiers dying in training accidents that shouldn't have happened. Teams making tactical errors that more experienced personnel could have avoided. Young men and women with their whole lives ahead of them, killed by the same kinds of devices I'd been disarming for 8 years. What's our timeline for implementing new protocols? 18 months from contract signing to full deployment across all EOD training facilities. We have teams at 6 different military installations gathering data, and we'll be presenting our preliminary recommendations to Pentagon officials in 2 weeks. 2 weeks! In 2 weeks, I'd be sitting across from generals and Defense Department officials, explaining how to save the lives of soldiers I'd never meet, but whose situations I understood better than anyone in that room would. It was exactly the kind of responsibility I'd been hoping to find in the civilian world. "I'd like to visit the training facilities personally," I said. "Observe current methods, talk to instructors and students. The best insights come from people who are actually doing the work." "Already arranged. You'll fly to Fort Bragg next Wednesday, then to Fort Leonard Wood the following week. After that, we'll have enough data to start developing our recommendations." She pulled out another folder, this one containing organizational charts and personnel profiles. "You'll be working with a team of 6 technical specialists, all former military with EOD experience. They've been waiting for someone with your background to take the lead." I studied the faces and service records of people who would become my colleagues, my responsibility, my team. Former sergeants and staff sergeants, specialists and corporals, all with combat experience and technical expertise. All older than me. all with years of civilian contracting experience I didn't have. In another company, at another interview, that might have been intimidating. Here it felt like reinforcement arriving when you needed it most. When do I meet them? This afternoon. We have a team meeting at 1400 to discuss the Fort Bragg visit and review preliminary findings. They're looking forward to working with someone who's been where they've been. The morning passed quickly as Colonel Stone walked me through Titan's systems and procedures. Security protocols, reporting requirements, client communication standards, all the bureaucratic machinery that kept a defense contracting company running. It was different from military bureaucracy, more focused on profit margins and contract deliverables, but the underlying principles were the same: attention to detail, chain of command, mission accomplishment above all else. At noon, she took me to lunch at a restaurant downtown, the kind of place where defense contractors and military officials met to discuss contracts over expensive steaks and imported wine. The hostess knew Colonel Stone by name and seated us at a quiet table near the back, away from other diners who might overhear sensitive conversations. "I want to ask you something," Colonel Stone said after we'd ordered. "How are you planning to handle the age issue when we meet with Pentagon officials?" It was a fair question, one I'd been thinking about since accepting the job. In 2 weeks, I'd be the youngest person in rooms full of colonels and generals, some of whom might have the same initial reaction as the executives at Peterson Associates. "I plan to let the work speak for itself," I said. "If I know the material and can provide valuable insights, age becomes irrelevant. If I don't, it becomes the easy excuse for dismissing everything else." Good answer, but be prepared for skepticism. Military culture has changed a lot in recent years, but there are still plenty of old-school officers who equate youth with inexperience. I've dealt with that before. In combat zones, competence gets recognized pretty quickly, regardless of age. Life and death situations have a way of cutting through preconceptions. She smiled at that, the expression of someone who'd made similar discoveries during her own career. "That's exactly why I hired you. You understand that credibility comes from results, not from looking the part." After lunch, we returned to Titan for my first team meeting. The conference room was smaller than the one where I'd interviewed, with a long table surrounded by chairs and walls covered with technical diagrams and deployment maps. 6 people were already seated when Colonel Stone and I arrived, all of them turning to look at me with expressions of professional curiosity. "Everyone, I'd like you to meet Sarah Martinez, our new technical lead." Colonel Stone gestured for me to take the seat at the head of the table. "Sarah, these are the people who'll be making our contract a success." The introductions went around the table. Mike Chin, former Army sergeant with 3 deployments to Iraq. Linda Rodriguez, former Marine corporal specializing in vehicle-borne devices. James Washington, former Navy petty officer with expertise in underwater explosives. Angela Turner, former Air Force staff sergeant who'd worked with international coalition forces. David Kim, former Army specialist with experience in chemical and biological threats. And Robert Hayes, former Marine sergeant, all of them older than me, all with impressive service records and civilian experience I lacked. But as they spoke about their backgrounds and areas of expertise, I noticed something that hadn't been present in any of my previous interviews: respect. They weren't looking at me like I was too young to be in charge. They were looking at me like a fellow professional whose qualifications they'd already verified. "Sarah's going to be leading our field observations and client presentations," Colonel Stone explained. "She'll also be responsible for developing our final recommendations and training protocols." "What's your background in protocol development?" Linda Rodriguez asked. It wasn't a challenge, just a professional question from someone who wanted to understand how we'd be working together. "Direct implementation rather than formal development," I said. "But I spent 3 years training new EOD technicians in combat zones, which means I understand what works under pressure and what gets people killed." "That's more valuable than classroom theory," Mike Chen said. "Most protocol developers have never seen their recommendations tested in real-world conditions." The meeting lasted 2 hours as we reviewed current training methods, identified areas for improvement, and discussed our approach to the field observations. These people understood the technical challenges we were facing, the political dynamics of working with Pentagon officials, and the life-and-death importance of getting our recommendations right. For the first time since leaving the military, I felt like I was working with people who spoke my language. As the meeting broke up, Angela Turner approached me with a question about the Fort Bragg visit. "Have you worked with their current training cadre before?" "I know some of the instructors from my time at Eglin." Not directly, but I've heard good things about their program. The casualty rates suggest there are issues, but that doesn't mean the people aren't competent. Agreed. Sometimes the best instructors are limited by outdated curricula or insufficient resources. She paused, studying my face with the kind of assessment that comes from years of evaluating personnel under stress. Can I ask you something personal? Sure. How old were you when you started EOD training? 21. I did 4 years as regular infantry first. So you've been doing this work since most people were figuring out what to major in college. Something like that. She nodded slowly. I thought so. There's something about people who start young in high-stakes work. You develop instincts that can't be taught in classroom settings. It was the first time anyone had framed my age as an advantage rather than a liability. The idea that starting young in dangerous work might actually create better judgment rather than worse had never occurred to me, but Angela was right. By the time most people were graduating from college, I'd already learned to make life-and-death decisions under pressure. By the time they were starting their careers, I'd already been tested in ways that revealed character and competence. The rest of the week passed in a blur of briefings, document reviews, and preparation for the Fort Bragg visit. I had my own office now, with windows overlooking downtown Phoenix and walls where I could display my military certificates and commendations. For the first time in months, I felt like I was building something rather than just surviving from one interview to the next. Friday afternoon brought an unexpected phone call. The number was unfamiliar, but the voice was one I recognized immediately. Ms. Martinez. This is James Peterson from Peterson Associates. I hope I'm not calling it a bad time. James Peterson. The man who'd dismissed my qualifications because I looked too young to have accomplished what my resume claimed. The last person I'd expected to hear from, especially now that I was settled into work that actually valued my experience. Certainly, during our Fort Bragg observations, we witnessed a training exercise where students encountered a vehicle-borne device with multiple trigger mechanisms. The standard protocol they'd learned was to identify the primary trigger and neutralize it first, then address secondary mechanisms in order of complexity. I paused, remembering similar situations from my own combat experience. However, the device in this scenario was designed with the primary trigger serving as a decoy. Attempting to neutralize it first would have activated a secondary mechanism, resulting in detonation. Under current training methods, students identified the apparent primary trigger and proceeded according to protocol, which would have been fatal in a real-world situation. How would your proposed methods address this? Our scenario-based approach teaches students to analyze the entire device before committing to any specific neutralization sequence. Instead of following predetermined protocols, they learn to consider why a device might be configured in a particular way, what the bomb maker was trying to accomplish, and how they might have disguised or protected critical components. General Hayes nodded slowly. Essentially, you're teaching them to think like adversaries rather than just technicians. Exactly. In combat zones, we're not facing academic problems with textbook solutions. We're facing opponents who understand our training and deliberately design devices to exploit our standard procedures. Our training needs to prepare students for that reality. The discussion continued for another hour with detailed questions about implementation costs, training timelines, and coordination between service branches. These officials understood that changing training protocols across the entire military would be a massive undertaking, requiring careful planning and significant resources. But they also understood that the current approach was killing personnel who deserved better preparation for the dangers they'd face. Finally, Colonel Burke from Special Operations Command asked the question I'd been expecting. Ms. Martinez, you've presented compelling evidence and detailed recommendations, but you look quite young to have accumulated the experience you're describing. Can you help us understand how someone your age developed this level of expertise? There it was, the same question that had derailed so many interviews, the assumption that youth automatically meant inexperience. But this time I was prepared with documentation rather than just words, and I was speaking to people who understood that military service could accelerate professional development in ways that civilian careers couldn't match. I enlisted at 17 with my parents' permission and immediately began infantry training. After my first deployment, I applied for EOD school and was accepted based on aptitude test scores and recommendations from my commanding officers. By the time most people my age were finishing college, I'd already completed 2 combat deployments and was training other soldiers in explosive device recognition and neutralization. I clicked to a slide showing my service timeline, with deployment dates, training completions, and promotion history clearly documented. Military service doesn't follow civilian career development patterns. When lives depend on competence, age becomes irrelevant compared to ability and experience. General Washington studied the timeline carefully. According to this, you were leading training operations by age 24. Yes, ma'am. In combat zones, leadership opportunities come to people who demonstrate competence under pressure, regardless of their age or time in service. I was promoted to positions of responsibility because I could do the work effectively, not because I'd accumulated enough years to qualify for advancement. Admiral Chen leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. That's actually an important point for our consideration. If we're going to modify training methods, we need instructors who understand both current threats and effective teaching techniques. Someone with Ms. Martinez's background could be invaluable in developing and implementing these new protocols. The meeting concluded with tentative approval for a pilot program at 3 installations, pending detailed cost analysis and coordination with existing training schedules. It wasn't the immediate, comprehensive adoption I'd hoped for, but it was a significant step forward, validation that our recommendations had merit and could make a real difference in personnel safety. As we gathered our materials and prepared to leave, General Hayes approached me directly. Ms. Martinez, I wanted to thank you for an excellent presentation. It's clear that you understand both the technical challenges and the human factors involved in effective training. Thank you, ma'am. I hope our recommendations can help reduce the casualty rates we've been seeing. I believe they will, but I also wanted to mention that we have other initiatives where your expertise could be valuable. Would you be interested in consulting on additional projects? Additional projects with the Army Training and Doctrine Command, working directly with the officials responsible for preparing soldiers for combat operations. 6 months ago, I'd been struggling to convince anyone that my military experience had civilian value. Now, I was being recruited by senior military officials who recognized that value immediately. I'd be very interested in learning more about those opportunities, ma'am. Outstanding. I'll have my staff reach out to coordinate schedules and discuss specifics. The flight back to Phoenix gave me time to process what had happened. In a single afternoon, I'd briefed some of the most senior military officials in the country, presented recommendations that could save lives, and been invited to participate in additional projects that would allow me to continue using my experience in meaningful ways. Angela sat beside me, reviewing her notes from the meeting. That was exceptional work, she said. I've been to dozens of Pentagon briefings, and I've never seen a more thorough or compelling presentation. It helped that we had solid data and clear recommendations. The work spoke for itself. The work was important, but the delivery made the difference. You understood your audience, you anticipated their concerns, and you presented everything in terms they could immediately understand and act upon. She was right, of course. The success of the briefing hadn't just been about having good information. It had been about communicating that information effectively to people who needed to make decisions based on what they heard. It was a skill I developed through years of briefing military commanders under various circumstances. But I'd never thought of it as something transferable to civilian contexts. Back in Phoenix, the response to our Pentagon presentation was immediate and enthusiastic. Colonel Stone called a team meeting for Friday morning to discuss follow-up actions and begin planning for the pilot program implementation. But more importantly, word of our success had spread through the defense contracting community, and Titan Defense Solutions was already receiving inquiries about similar projects from other government agencies. This is how careers are built, Colonel Stone told me during a private meeting in her office. You identify a critical need, develop effective solutions, and prove your value to people who can provide additional opportunities. What you did this week positions you as a subject matter expert in one of the military's highest priority areas. It feels good to be using my experience in work that matters. That's just the beginning. The pilot program will require ongoing oversight and refinement. The additional projects General Hayes mentioned will probably involve training development for other specialties. And based on the calls I've been receiving, other agencies are interested in similar analyses for their own training programs. She leaned forward, her expression serious but satisfied. Sarah, what I'm telling you is that you've found your niche. This combination of technical expertise, military experience, and communication skills is exactly what government agencies need but rarely find. You could build an entire career around this type of work. An entire career built around helping military personnel stay alive by sharing knowledge I'd gained through my own service. It was exactly what I'd hoped to find when I started looking for meaningful civilian work, but it was also more than I'd dared to imagine possible. That evening, I received a phone call from Master Sergeant Williams at Fort Bragg. "Ms. Martinez, I wanted to thank you for the time you spent with us last month. I heard your Pentagon presentation was very well received." "Thank you, Sergeant. Your cooperation and insights made all the difference in our analysis. I also wanted to let you know that we've already begun implementing some of your preliminary recommendations. The scenario-based exercises are working exactly as you predicted. Students are engaging with the material differently, thinking through problems instead of just applying memorized procedures." "That's excellent news. Are you seeing improved performance in assessments?" "More importantly, we're seeing improved decision-making in practical exercises. Students are taking time to analyze situations before acting, they're considering multiple approaches, and they're asking better questions when they encounter unfamiliar situations." This was the validation that mattered most. Not approval from Pentagon officials or recognition from senior executives, but confirmation that the changes we'd recommended were actually helping the soldiers who would face these dangers in real combat situations. "We've also had inquiries from other installations about adopting similar approaches," Master Sergeant Williams continued. "Word travels fast in the EOD community, and when people hear about methods that improve safety and effectiveness, they want to implement them immediately." After hanging up, I sat in my apartment thinking about how much had changed since that first interview at Peterson Associates. Then, I'd been Sarah Martinez, the young veteran who couldn't get hired because she looked too inexperienced for serious work. Now, I was Sarah Martinez, the subject matter expert whose recommendations were being implemented across multiple military installations. But the most significant change wasn't in how others perceived me. It was in how I understood my own value. The experience and knowledge I'd gained during 15 years of military service weren't just personal accomplishments or interesting stories to share during interviews. They were professional assets that could make a real difference in important work. Capabilities that were rare and valuable in the right contexts. The following Monday brought news that the pilot program had been approved for full implementation, with Titan Defense Solutions receiving a contract worth $18 million over 4 years. More importantly, 2 other service branches had requested similar analyses of their training programs, and the Department of Homeland Security had inquired about applying our methods to civilian bomb disposal training. "This is what success looks like in the defense contracting world," Colonel Stone explained during our team meeting. "One successful project leads to multiple opportunities, and before you know it, you're the go-to organization for specific types of work." She handed me a folder containing preliminary information about the new projects. "I'm recommending that you lead all of them. You have the technical expertise, you've proven you can work effectively with government clients, and frankly, you're developing a reputation as someone who gets results. Leading multiple projects simultaneously, working with officials from different agencies, managing teams of technical specialists. 6 months ago, I'd been told I was too young for entry-level positions at companies that couldn't spell ordnance correctly. Now, I was being offered responsibility for projects worth millions of dollars and the opportunity to influence training protocols across the entire federal government." That afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor. The receptionist called to let me know that someone was asking to see me, someone who claimed we'd met before but wouldn't provide additional details. "Send them up," I said, curious about who might be visiting without an appointment. The elevator doors opened to reveal a young woman in army dress blues, her uniform crisp, and her bearing unmistakably military. She was maybe 22 or 23, with the kind of nervous energy that suggested she was either very excited or very worried about something. "Ms. Martinez, I'm Specialist Jennifer Walsh. I was one of the students at Fort Bragg when you visited last month." I remembered her from the training observations, a bright young soldier who'd asked thoughtful questions during the exercises and demonstrated excellent technical skills despite limited experience. "Of course. What brings you to Phoenix, Specialist Walsh?" "I'm actually PCSing to Luke Air Force Base next month, but I wanted to stop by and thank you personally for the changes you recommended to our training program." "How so?" "The scenario-based exercises you developed probably saved my life. Last week, during a field training exercise, I encountered a device that was configured exactly like one of the scenarios you'd created. 6 months ago, I would have followed standard protocol and probably triggered a secondary mechanism. Instead, I remembered the thinking process you'd taught us and took time to analyze the entire device before proceeding. She paused, her expression serious. The device was designed to exploit standard neutralization procedures. If I'd approached it the old way, I'd probably be dead right now. This was why the work mattered, not for the contracts or the recognition or the career opportunities, but for moments like this when someone went home alive because they'd been taught to think differently about dangerous situations. I'm glad the training was helpful, but the credit belongs to you for applying what you learned under pressure. Maybe, but the point is that you gave me tools I didn't have before. You changed how I think about the work, and that made all the difference when it mattered most. After she left, I sat in my office thinking about the chain of events that had brought me to this point. A chance phone call from Colonel Stone, a successful interview based on mutual understanding rather than appearance, a Pentagon presentation that opened doors to opportunities I'd never imagined possible. Each step had built on the previous one, creating momentum that was now carrying me toward work that felt meaningful and important. But the most important realization was that none of it had required me to become someone different. I hadn't needed to develop new skills or change my approach to professional challenges. I'd simply needed to find people who could recognize the value of what I already brought to the table. 3 months later, I was standing in another Pentagon briefing room, this time presenting training recommendations to officials from all 4 service branches plus representatives from the Department of Homeland Security and the Central Intelligence Agency. The audience was larger, the scope was broader, and the potential impact was greater than anything I'd worked on before. Current training methods across all federal agencies assume that explosive threats will conform to known patterns and established procedures, I began, addressing a room full of people whose decisions affected thousands of personnel worldwide. Our analysis indicates that this assumption is increasingly invalid, and that adaptive training methods can significantly improve both safety and effectiveness. The presentation lasted 2 hours, with detailed discussions about implementation strategies, resource requirements, and expected outcomes. But the core message was the same one I'd been delivering since that first Pentagon briefing. People perform better when they're taught to think rather than just to follow procedures. And training programs that emphasize adaptive problem-solving produce better results than those focused on pattern recognition. When I finished, the response was immediate and enthusiastic. Questions about timeline, requests for additional analysis, and invitations to brief other agencies on similar topics. The work that had started with observations at a single military installation was now expanding to influence training programs across the entire federal government. After the meeting, General Hayes approached me with a proposal that would have seemed impossible just a year earlier. Sarah, we've been so impressed with your work that we'd like to offer you a position as Senior Technical Advisor for Training Innovation. It would involve working directly with the Joint Chiefs of Staff on training policy for all service branches. Senior Technical Advisor reporting directly to the highest levels of military leadership, the kind of position that typically required decades of military service and advanced degrees from prestigious institutions. The kind of opportunity that would have been unthinkable when I was struggling to convince anyone that my experience had civilian value. I'm honored by the offer, General, but I'm very happy with my current position at Titan Defense Solutions. Of course, but I wanted you to know that the option exists. Your work has had significant impact on military training across all service branches, and there are opportunities for even greater influence if you're interested in pursuing them. The flight back to Phoenix gave me time to reflect on how much had changed since that first interview at Peterson Associates. Then, I'd been desperate for any opportunity to prove myself, willing to accept almost any position that would allow me to use my military experience in meaningful work. Now, I was being recruited by senior government officials for positions I'd never imagined pursuing, but the most important change wasn't in the opportunities available to me. It was in my understanding of what those 15 years of military service actually meant. They weren't just background experience or interesting stories to share during interviews. They were professional qualifications that made me uniquely valuable for specific types of work, capabilities that couldn't be learned in classrooms or developed through civilian career progression. Back at Titan Defense Solutions, Colonel Stone was waiting with news about our latest contract expansion. The success of your training innovations has positioned us as the primary contractor for military training analysis across all federal agencies, she said, barely able to contain her satisfaction. We're looking at contracts worth over $100 million over the next 5 years, all based on work that started with your Pentagon presentation. $100 million in contracts, dozens of projects, hundreds of personnel whose lives would be affected by training programs based on recommendations I'd developed. It was the kind of professional impact that most people spend entire careers trying to achieve. More importantly, she continued, you've created a new specialty within the defense contracting industry. Other companies are trying to hire people with similar backgrounds, but they're discovering that experience like yours can't be recruited from civilian populations. You've essentially created a market for military veterans with specific technical expertise and communication skills. She was right. Over the past year, I'd received dozens of calls from other companies trying to recruit me, from government agencies interested in consulting arrangements, and from military veterans who wanted advice about transitioning to civilian careers in defense contracting. The combination of technical expertise, military experience, and ability to communicate effectively with government clients had proven to be rare and valuable. But the most satisfying aspect of the work wasn't the professional recognition or financial success. It was the knowledge that recommendations I'd developed were actually saving lives. Training programs based on our methods were producing personnel who made better decisions under pressure, who survived dangerous situations that might have killed them under previous training approaches, who came home alive from deployments that tested every skill they'd learned. That evening, I received a call from my former commanding officer, someone I hadn't spoken to since leaving the military. Martinez, I keep hearing your name mentioned in training circles. Apparently you've become some kind of civilian expert on EOD protocols. Something like that, sir. I found work that lets me use the experience I gained during my time in service. Outstanding. But I'm calling for a different reason. We have a situation developing overseas, and we need someone with your background to provide technical consultation. It would involve a temporary assignment to a forward operating base, working directly with EOD teams who are facing some new threat variants. Back to a forward operating base. Back to the environment where I'd learned everything that had made my civilian career possible. The opportunity to work directly with personnel who were facing the same dangers I'd faced. To share knowledge that could help them stay alive in situations I understood intimately. When would you need an answer, sir? End of the week. It's a 6-month assignment, classified at the highest levels, and it would involve significant personal risk. But the intelligence suggests that current training isn't preparing our people for what they're encountering in the field. After hanging up, I sat in my apartment thinking about the choice I was facing. I had a successful civilian career, financial security, and opportunities for continued professional growth. But I also had knowledge and experience that could make a difference for personnel who were facing life-and-death situations in combat zones. The decision, when I finally made it, felt inevitable. The work I'd been doing in the civilian world was important and meaningful, but it was also preparation for moments when that knowledge could be applied directly to save lives. Colonel Stone understood immediately when I explained the situation. Take the assignment, she said without hesitation. The experience you gain will make you even more valuable when you return, and frankly, it's the right thing to do. People with your background have obligations that go beyond civilian career considerations. 6 months later, I was standing in the desert of an undisclosed location, briefing EOD teams about threat recognition techniques I'd developed through analysis of devices encountered during recent operations. The personnel I was training were young, serious, and absolutely focused on staying alive long enough to complete their deployments and return home to families who were counting on them. The most important thing to remember, I told them during one of our training sessions, is that your enemies study our training methods just as carefully as we study their tactics. They design devices specifically to exploit standard procedures and conventional thinking. Your survival depends on your ability to think beyond established patterns and adapt to situations you've never encountered before. One of the students, a sergeant who couldn't have been more than 25, raised her hand. Ma'am, how do you develop that kind of adaptive thinking? How do you learn to see beyond what you've been taught? It was the same question I'd been asked in Pentagon briefings, in corporate conference rooms, and in military training facilities around the world. The answer was always the same, but it felt especially important in this context, where the consequences of inadequate preparation were immediate and permanent. You start by understanding that competence isn't about age or experience or how long you've been doing something. It's about your ability to analyze situations, make decisions under pressure, and adapt when circumstances change. Some people develop that capability quickly, others never develop it at all. What matters is recognizing that it's the most important skill you can possess in this work. The training continued for weeks, with exercises designed to challenge conventional thinking and scenarios that required creative problem-solving under pressure. These personnel were learning the same adaptive approaches that had become the foundation of training programs across multiple federal agencies, but they were learning them in an environment where mistakes had immediate consequences. When my assignment ended and I returned to Phoenix, I brought with me new insights about threat evolution and training effectiveness that would influence the next generation of recommendations. The cycle was continuing. Field experience informing training development improving field performance, and field performance generating new insights that would improve future training. Back at Titan Defense Solutions, my office had been moved to the executive floor, with windows overlooking the entire Phoenix Valley, and walls lined with commendations from military units whose training had been improved by programs I'd developed. The Bronze Star certificate that Colonel Stone had presented to me years earlier was now surrounded by other recognition, letters from Pentagon officials, awards from professional organizations, and photographs from training facilities where lives were being saved through better preparation. But the item I valued most was a challenge coin from the EOD team I'd worked with during my overseas assignment, presented to me by personnel who understood that the knowledge I'd shared with them had made the difference between coming home alive and not coming home at all. On my desk was a letter from Specialist Walsh, who had been promoted to sergeant and was now serving as an EOD instructor at Fort Bragg. Her letter described how she was teaching the adaptive thinking methods I'd developed, passing on to new students the same approaches that had probably saved her life during that field training exercise. "The techniques you taught us aren't just training methods," she wrote. "They're ways of thinking that change how we approach every aspect of the work. I'm seeing students who are more confident, more capable, and more likely to make good decisions under pressure. The impact of what you did extends far beyond the original recommendations." That afternoon, I received a phone call from someone I hadn't heard from in over 2 years, James Peterson from Peterson Associates, Sarah. "I hope you remember me. We interviewed you about 2 years ago for a defense contracting position." I remembered the interview clearly. The skeptical questions, the dismissive comments about my age, the assumption that I was exaggerating my military experience because I looked too young to have accomplished what my resume claimed. "Of course, Mr. Peterson. I was calling because I've been following your work through industry publications, and I wanted to congratulate you on your remarkable success. The training programs you've developed have apparently had significant impact across the entire defense establishment. Thank you. I also wanted to discuss the possibility of working together on some upcoming projects. We have several contracts that would benefit from someone with your expertise, and I think we could offer you opportunities that would be mutually beneficial." 2 years ago, his company had dismissed me as too young and inexperienced for entry-level work. Now, after I'd established myself as a recognized expert in my field, he was calling to discuss opportunities that would be mutually beneficial. "I appreciate the interest, Mr. Peterson, but I'm very satisfied with my current position." "Of course. But I hope you'll keep us in mind if your situation changes. The defense contracting industry has evolved significantly over the past few years, and companies that recognize talent regardless of conventional expectations are the ones that succeed." After hanging up, I reflected on how much had changed since that first interview, not just in my career or professional recognition, but in my understanding of what military service had given me and how that experience translated to civilian contexts. The 15 years I'd spent in the Army hadn't just been time served or background experience. They had been professional development of the most intensive kind. Preparation for responsibilities and challenges that most people never face. Education in decision-making under pressure that can't be learned in any classroom or civilian context. But the most important lesson hadn't been about technical skills or military knowledge. It had been about understanding that competence and capability aren't determined by age or appearance or conventional career progression. They're determined by what you can do when it matters most, by your ability to perform under pressure and make decisions that affect other people's lives. That evening, I received an email from a young woman named Lisa Chen, a recent college graduate who was considering military service as a path to meaningful civilian career opportunities. "Ms. Martinez," she wrote, I've been reading about your work in defense contracting, and I'm inspired by how you've been able to use military experience in such impactful civilian roles. I'm considering enlisting in the Army with the goal of eventually working in fields like yours. Do you have any advice for someone just starting this journey? I spent considerable time crafting my response, thinking about what I would have wanted someone to tell me when I was 17, and making the decision to enlist rather than go directly to college. Lisa, I wrote back. The most important thing to understand is that military service isn't just a job or a stepping stone to civilian careers. It's professional development that can't be replicated in any other environment. You'll learn to make decisions under pressure, to take responsibility for outcomes that affect other people's lives, and to perform at your best when everything depends on getting it right. But more importantly, you'll discover capabilities you didn't know you had. The military has a way of revealing what people are truly capable of when they're challenged and supported appropriately. That self-knowledge becomes the foundation for everything you do afterward. If you choose this path, don't let anyone tell you that you're too young for real responsibility or that your age disqualifies you from serious work. Military service accelerates professional development in ways that civilian careers can't match. Trust in your own competence, seek out opportunities to prove yourself, and remember that the most important battles are often fought by people who don't look like what others expect warriors to look like. As I finished the email, I thought about my own journey from that 17-year-old who'd enlisted with her parents' permission to the technical expert who was now influencing training policy across the entire federal government. The path hadn't always been smooth, and there had been plenty of people who'd questioned whether someone my age could handle serious responsibility. But every challenge had been preparation for the next opportunity. Every rejection had led to better possibilities, and every moment of doubt had been resolved by focusing on the work itself rather than other people's perceptions of my capabilities. The young woman who'd walked into Peterson Associates 2 years ago, desperate for any opportunity to prove herself, had become someone who was being recruited by senior government officials for positions she'd never imagined pursuing. The difference wasn't in developing new skills or changing fundamental approaches to work. It was in finding people who could recognize the value of what she'd always brought to the table. Military service had given me technical expertise, leadership experience, and the ability to perform under pressure. But it had also given me something more important: the understanding that competence matters more than appearance, that capability is more valuable than conventional expectations, and that the most important work is often done by people who don't fit traditional molds. Now, as I prepared for another Pentagon briefing about training innovations that could save lives, I carried with me the knowledge that 15 years of military service had been exactly the right preparation for work that mattered. Not because someone had given me a chance despite my limitations, but because I'd found people who understood that those 15 years represented capabilities that couldn't be duplicated through any other path. The story that had begun with a teenage decision to serve my country had evolved into a civilian career that continued that service in different ways. And for the first time since leaving the military, I understood that the transition from soldier to civilian hadn't required becoming someone different. It had simply required finding the right place to be exactly who I'd always been. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.